And isn't it the typical white hierarchical family household of father, mother, their common children, and prospective heirs, and their bourgeois conduct and lifestyle, that is everything that the left despises, disparages, and maligns? Isn't it that lifestyle and that social order that is the economically most successful model of social organization the world has ever seen, with the greatest accumulation of capital goods and wealth and the highest average living standards?
So to speak.
There can be peaceful coexistence of different cultures on distant, physically separated territories, but multiculturalism, cultural heterogeneity, cannot exist in one and the same place and territory without leading to diminishing social trust, increased tension, and ultimately the call for a strong man and the destruction of anything resembling a libertarian social order. Moreover, just as the libertarian order must always be on guard against bad, even if non-aggressive neighbors by means of social ostracism, that is, by a common "you are not welcome here" culture. So, and indeed even more vigilantly so, must it be guarded against neighbors who openly advocate communism, socialism, syndicalism, or democracy in any shape or form. These people, in thereby posing an open threat to all private property and property owners, must not only be shunned, but they must, to use the by now somewhat famous Hoppe meme, be physically removed.
So to speak.
If need be, by violence and forced to leave for other pastures. Not
I first want to explain to you what I consider to be the problem of social order. Alone on this island, Robinson Crusoe can obviously do whatever he pleases. For him, the question concerning rules of orderly human conduct and of social cooperation simply does not arise. This question can only arise once a second person, namely Friday, arrives on the island. Yet even then, the question remains largely irrelevant so long as no scarcity exists. Suppose the island is the Garden of Eden. All external goods are available in superabundance. They are free goods, just as air that we breathe is a free good under normal circumstances. Whatever Crusoe does with these goods, his actions have no repercussions, neither with respect to his own future supply of such goods, nor regarding the present or future supply of the same goods for Friday. Hence, it is impossible that a conflict concerning the use of such goods can arise between Crusoe and Friday. Conflict is possible only if goods are scarce, and only then is there a need to formulate rules that make orderly, conflict-free separation. In the Garden of Eden, only two scarce goods exist: a person's physical body and its only. Crusoe and Friday each have only one body and can stand only at one place at a time. Hence, even in the Garden of Eden, conflicts between Crusoe and Friday can arise, namely, if Crusoe and Friday would want to occupy the same standing room simultaneously without coming into physical conflict with each other. Accordingly, even in the Garden of Eden, rules of orderly social conduct must exist, namely rules regarding the proper location and movement of human bodies. And outside the Garden of Eden, in the realm of all-around scarcity, there must be rules that regulate the use not only of personal bodies, such that all possible conflicts can be ruled out. Now, this is the problem of social order. In the history of social and political thought, various proposals have been offered as solutions to the problem of social order, and this multitude of mutually incompatible proposals has contributed to the widespread belief that the search for a single correct solution is futile and illusory. Yet a correct solution does exist. There is no reason to succumb to moral relativism. Indeed, the solution to the problem of social order has been known for hundreds of years. The solution is the idea of private property. Now let me formulate the solution first for the special case represented by the Garden of Eden, and then for the general case represented by the real world of all-around scarcity. In the Garden of Eden, the solution is provided by the simple rule stipulating that everyone may play or move his own body wherever he chooses, provided everyone else is already standing there and occupying the same space. And outside the Garden of Eden, in the realm of all-around scarcity, the solution is provided by four logically interrelated rules. First, every person is the private, exclusive owner of his own physical body. Second, who else, if not Crusoe, should be the owner of Crusoe's body? Friday, or Friday and Crusoe jointly? Yet these solutions, somebody else owns my body, or that my body is owned jointly by myself and somebody else, yet these other rules would not help avoid conflict, rather it would create conflict and make conflict permanent. Second, every person is the private owner of all nature-given goods that he can perceive as scarce and distributed by means of his body, before anybody else has done so. Again, who else, if not the first owner, the first user should be their owner? The second user, or the first and the second user jointly? Yet again, such rulings would be contrary to the very purpose of norms, namely of helping to avoid conflict rather than create it. Third, every person who, with the help of his body and his originally appropriated goods, produces new products, thereby becomes the proper owner of these products, provided only that in the process of production he does not physically damage the goods owned by other persons. And fourth, once a good has been acquired through original appropriation or been produced, ownership in such a good can only be acquired by means of a voluntary contractual transfer of its property title from a previous to a later owner. I will spare myself here the task of providing a detailed ethical as well as economic justification of elsewhere. If you look in my book on theory of socialism and capitalism, you find detailed justifications of these rules, or in my book on the essay economics of private property. However, a few statements in this connection are in order. Contrary to the frequently heard claim that the institution of private property is only some sort of convention, it must be categorically stated that a convention serves a purpose and it is something to which an alternative exists. The Latin alphabet, for instance, serves the purpose of written communication, and there exists an alternative to it, such as, for instance, the Cyrillic alphabet. That is why it is referred to as a convention. What, however, is the purpose of norms? If that personal conflict existed, that is, if due to some pre-stabilized harmony of all interests, no situation ever arises in which two or more people want to use one and the same good in incompatible ways, then we would not need any norms. It is the purpose of norms to help avoid otherwise unavoidable conflict. Now, a norm that generates conflict rather than help avoid it is contrary to the very purpose of norms. It is a dysfunctional norm or a perversion. And with regard to the purpose of conflict avoidance, the institution of private property is definitely not just a convention, because no alternative would exist. Only private, exclusive property makes it possible that all otherwise unavoidable conflicts can be avoided. And only the principle of property acquisition through acts of original appropriation performed by specific individuals at specific points in time and at specific locations makes it possible that conflicts can be avoided from the beginning of mankind onward. Since only the first appropriation of some previously unappropriated good can be conflict-free, simply because, by definition, no one else had any previous dealings with this good. Now, as important as this insight is, that is, the insight that the institution of private property, ultimately grounded in acts of original appropriation, is without alternative, given the desire, given the goal of conflict-free interaction, of peace, it is not sufficient to establish a functioning social order. For even if everyone knows how conflict can be avoided, it is still possible that people simply do not want to avoid conflict because they expect to benefit from it at the expense of others. In fact, as long as mankind is what it is, there will always exist murderers, robbers, thieves, thugs, and con artists. And that is people who do not act according to these rules that I mentioned before. Hence, every social order, if it is to be successfully maintained, requires institutions and mechanisms designed to keep such rule breakers in check. How to accomplish this task and by who? The standard reply to this question is to say, this task, that is the enforcement of law and order, is the first and primary duty, indeed the raison d'être of the state. In particular, this is also the answer given by classical liberals, such as my master, Ludwig von Mises. Whether or not this answer depends on how the state is. The state, according to the standard definition not in the definition that I just arbitrarily assumed here. According to the standard definition, is not a regular specialized firm. Rather, the state is defined as an agency that is characterized by two unique, logically connected features. The first one is the state is an agency that exercises a territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making. That is, the state is the ultimate arbiter in everything conflicts involving itself. It allows no appeal above and beyond itself. And second, the state is an agency that exercises a territorial monopoly of taxation. That is, it is an agency that unilaterally fixes the price that private citizens must pay for the state's service as ultimate judge and enforcer of law and order. Now, as widespread as the standard view concerning the necessity of the institution of the state as a provider of law and order is, it stands in clear contradiction to elementary economic and moral laws and principles. First off, among economists and philosophers, there exist two near universally accepted propositions. The first one is, every monopoly is bad from the viewpoint of consumers, not from the viewpoint of the producer. Every producer loves to be a monopolist. Monopoly is here understood in its classic meaning as an exclusive privilege granted to a single producer of a commodity or a service, or as the absence of free entry into one particular line of production. Only one agency, Agency A, may produce a given good or service X. Such a monopoly is bad for consumers because, shielded from potential new entrants into a given area of production, the price of the product will be higher and the quality will be lower than would otherwise be the case under competitive conditions. The second universally accepted proposition among economists and philosophers is the production of law and order, that is, of security, is the primary function of the state as I just defined it. Security is here understood in the wide sense that is adopted in the American Declaration of Independence, namely as the protection of life, property, and the pursuit of happiness from domestic violence, crime, as well as external or foreign aggression, that is, of war. Now, both of these propositions are apparently incompatible with each other. This, however, has rarely caused any concern among philosophers and economists. And insofar as it did concern any problems for them, the typical reaction has been one of taking exception with the first proposition, the monopoly proposition, rather than the second one, that we need a monopolist of law and order. Yet there exist fundamental theoretical reasons and mountains of empirical evidence that it is indeed the second proposition, that we need a monopolist to protect us, which is false. As a territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making and of law enforcement, the state is not just like any other monopoly, such as a milk or a car monopoly that produces milk or cars of comparatively lower quality and higher prices. In contrast to all other monopolies, the state is does not only produce inferior goods, lousy goods, but bads or non-goods. In fact, the state must first produce bads, such as taxes, for instance, before it can produce anything that might be considered a lousy product. If an agency is the ultimate judge in every case of conflict, then it is also judge in all conflicts involving itself. Consequently, instead of merely preventing and resolving conflicts, a monopolist of ultimate decision-making will also cause and provoke conflict in order to settle it then to his own advantage. That is, if one can appeal to the state only for justice, justice will be necessarily perverted in favor of the state. Constitutions and Supreme Courts notwithstanding. These constitutions and courts are always state constitutions and state courts, and whatever limitations on state action they may set or find invariably is decided by agents of the very same institution under consideration. Predictably then, the definition of property and protection will be continually altered and the range of jurisdiction expanded to the state's advantage. The idea of some given, eternal and immutable law that must be discovered will completely disappear and will be replaced by the idea of law as legislation, that is, as arbitrary state-made law. Moreover, as ultimate judge, the state is also a monopolist of taxation. That is, it can unilaterally, without the consent of everyone affected, determine the price that its subject must pay for the state's provision of perverted law. However, a tax-funded life and property protection agency is a contradiction in terms. It is an expropriating property protector, motivated then, as everyone is, by self-interest and by the disutility of labor, but equipped with a unique power to tax. State agents will invariably strive to maximize expenditures on protection, and almost all of the nation's wealth can be conceivably consumed by the cost of protection, and at the same time to minimize the actual production of protection. The more money one can spend and the less one must work for it, the better off one is. Now, apart from the fundamental error of statism in general, additional errors are involved in the special case of a democratic state. A detailed treatment of this subject, again, has been provided by myself in another book of mine, Democracy, the God That Failed, but I want to make at least a brief mention of this. The traditional pre-modern state form is that of an absolute monarchy. Yet monarchies were faulted, in particular also by classical liberals such as Mises, for being incompatible with the basic principle of equality before the law. Monarchy instead rested, obviously, on personal privilege. Thus, the critics of monarchies argued the monarchical state had to be replaced by a democratic one. In opening participation and entry into state government to everyone on equal terms, not just to an hereditary class of nobles, it was thought that the principle of equality of all before the law had been satisfied. However, this democratic equality before the law is something entirely different than and incompatible with the idea of one universal law equally applicable to everyone, everywhere, and at all times. In fact, the objectionable schism and inequality of a higher law of kings versus the subordinate law of ordinary subjects is fully preserved under democracy in the separation of public versus private law and the supremacy of public law over private law. Under democracy, everyone is equal insofar as entry into government is open to all on equal terms. Everyone can become king, so to say, not only a privileged circle of people. Thus, in democracy, no personal privileges or privileged persons exist. However, functional privileges and privileged functions continue to exist. Public officials, as long as they act in an official capacity, are governed and protected by public law and occupy thereby a privileged position vis-à-vis persons acting under the mere authority of private law. In particular, public officials are permitted to finance or subsidize their own activities through taxes. That is, they do not, as every private law subject must, earn their income through the production and the subsequent sale of goods or services to voluntarily buying or not buying consumers. Rather, as public officials, they are permitted to engage in and live off what in private dealings between private law subjects is considered theft and stolen loot. Thus, privilege and legal discrimination and the distinction between rulers and subjects will not disappear under democracy. To the contrary, rather than being restricted to princes and nobles, under democracy, privileges will be available to everyone. Everyone can engage now in theft and live off stolen loot if only he becomes a public official. Predictably then, under democratic conditions, the tendency of every monopoly of ultimate decision-making to increase the price of justice and to lower its quality and substitute injustice for justice is not diminished, but is actually aggravated. As an hereditary monopolist, a king or a prince regards the territory and the people under his jurisdiction as his personal property and engages in the monopolistic exploitation of this property. Under democracy, monopoly and monopolistic exploitation do not disappear. Rather, what happens is simply this. Instead of a prince and a nobility who regard the country as their private property, a temporary and interchangeable caretaker is put in monopolistic charge of the country. The caretaker does not own the country, but as long as he is in office, he is permitted to use it to his and his protégés' advantage. He owns its current use, or what is called usufruct, but he does not own its capital stock. This does not eliminate exploitation. To the contrary, it makes exploitation less calculating and carried out with little or no regard to the capital stock. Exploitation becomes short-sighted and capital consumption will be systematically promoted. Let me just give an example. I can give you a house and make you the owner of it. Or I can make you a temporary caretaker of the house. For 4 years you can try to get as much out of the house as you want. But you cannot pass it on as an inheritance. You cannot sell it in the market and so forth. Will you treat the house in a different way? Whether you are a private owner who can pass it on in the form of an inheritance, or will be you just a temporary caretaker who cannot pass it on, who cannot sell it in the market? And the answer should be clear as daylight, of course. if you are only a temporary caretaker of the house, you try to run down the capital, get as much out of it in as short a possible time as possible, whereas as a private owner, you will try to preserve the value of it in order to pass it on in some sort of intact form to the next generation. Democratic politicians are people who try to rob the country as quickly as possible, because after 4 years they have no chance to rob anymore, or after 8 years, whatever the term is. Now it's a state, and especially the democratic state then, is demonstrably incapable of creating and maintaining social order. If, instead of helping avoid conflict, the state is a source of permanent conflict, and if, rather than assuring legal security and predictability, the state itself continuously generates insecurity and unpredictability through its legislation and replaces constant law with flexible and arbitrary legislation, then inescapably the question arises as to what is then the correct and obviously non-statist solution to the problem of enforcing social order. Now the solution is what I call a private law society. That is, a society in which every individual and institution is subject to one and the same set of laws. No public law granting privileges to specific persons or specific countries, and no public property exists in this society. There is only private law and private property, equally applicable to each and everyone. No one is permitted to acquire property by any means other than through original appropriation, production, or voluntary exchange. And no one possesses a privilege to tax and expropriate. Moreover, in a private law society, no one is permitted to prohibit anyone else from using his property in order to enter any line of production he wishes to enter and compete against whomever he wants to compete. Specifically regarding the problem at hand, that is, in a private law society, the production of security, of law and order, will be undertaken by freely financed individuals and agencies competing for a voluntarily paying clientele or non-paying clientele, just as a production of all other goods and services. Now, it would be presumptuous to wanting to predict the precise shape and form of the security industry that would emerge within the framework of a private law society. However, it is not difficult at all to predict a few central changes that would fundamentally and favorably distinguish a competitive security industry from the present, all too well-known statist production of injustice and disorder. First off, while in a complex society based on the division of labor, self-defense will play only a secondary role, as I will explain in a moment, it should be emphasized from the outset that in a private law society, everyone's right to defend oneself from aggression against one's person and property is entirely undisputed. In distinct contrast to the present situation, present situation, in which members are increasingly unarmed and defenseless against aggressors, in a private law society, no restrictions on the private ownership of firearms and other weapons exist. Everyone's elementary right to engage in self-defense, to protect his life and property against invaders would be sacrosanct. And as one knows from the experience of the not-so-wild Wild West, as well as numerous recent empirical investigations into the relationship between the frequency of gun ownership and crime rates, more guns imply less crime. Recall this Norwegian incident that just happened. For 40 minutes, this guy was shooting down people. Now, would that have been possible if people had been armed? He might have killed a single person, and then he would have been dead himself. Just as in today's complex economy, we do not produce our own shoes or suits or telephones, but partake in the advantages of the division of labor, so it is also to be expected that we will also do so when it comes to the production of security, especially the more property a person owns and the richer a society becomes. Hence, most security services will, without doubt, be provided by specialized agencies competing for voluntarily paying clients, by various private police, insurance, and arbitration agencies. If one wanted to summarize in one word the decisive difference and advantage of a competitive security industry as compared to the current statist practice, this word would be contract. The state, as the ultimate decision maker and judge, operates currently in a contractless legal vacuum. There exists no contract between the state and its citizens. It is not contractually fixed what is actually owned by whom and what, according